Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today.
We're going to be tackling a pretty big topic that I think affects pretty much everyone.
Absolutely, and that is fear.
And to help us kind of navigate this complex subject.
We're going to be looking at the teachings of Osho,
Right.
who was a spiritual teacher and philosopher.
And really had some, I think, quite revolutionary ideas
Yeah.
about human psychology.
Quite ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
Yeah. And you know what's really interesting about Osho?
Is that he approached this whole idea of fear.
In a way that might surprise you.
Okay.
Because instead of,
seeing it as this enemy to conquer, like we often hear.
Yeah.
Fight your fears and all that.
Right.
He actually saw it as a natural...
Inherent part of being human.
Really?
And even potentially a pathway to growth.
Okay. I'm already intrigued.
So where do we even begin to understand fear?
From Osho's perspective, Osho really emphasized this idea that fear
That's very core.
is a natural instinct. Okay?
It's rooted in our desire to survive.
Yeah. Think about it like...
You see a speeding car coming right at you.
Yeah.
Fear kicks in. You jump out of the way.
That fear is actually what keeps you safe.
Right. Yeah, totally.
But what about, those fears?
That don't involve, immediate thing.
Like fear of public speaking or fear of failure.
Sure.
Those aren't exactly life or death situations.
Right. And that's where Osho draws a really important distinction.
Okay.
He differentiated between those practical fears.
The ones that are tied to our survival.
And what he called psychological fears.
Psychological fears. Okay.
What are those exactly?
So these are the fears that come from...
our thoughts, our beliefs, our past experiences.
Rather than, a real physical threat in that moment.
Okay.
So it's that knot in your stomach before a big presentation.
Right.
Not the fear of like a charging bear.
Gotcha.
They stem from things like...
societal conditioning.
past traumas.
Or even just imagined scenarios.
So it's not a tiger in the jungle, it's a tiger in our minds.
Exactly.
Osho argued that most of the fears that we grapple with
Are actually projections of our own minds.
Wow.
Anxieties about what might happen.
What could go wrong?
They're not rooted in what's actually happening in the present moment.
That's mind-blowing.
So much of what we fear is actually self-created.
Yeah, a lot of it.
But then where does the ego fit into all of this?
Because I always hear about how fear and the ego are kind of connected.
Well, Osho was very clear about the ego's role in perpetuating fear.
The ego, that part of us that is...
obsessed with our identity.
Our possessions, our relationships.
Is terrified of anything that threatens its sense of permanence.
Okay, so if we, experience a setback in our career...
or a relationship ends.
The ego freaks out because it feels like its own existence...
Exactly.
is being threatened.
Precisely.
Think about, how much fear we experience.
Around job loss, for example.
Yeah.
It's not just about the financial implication. It's about the hit to our sense of self-worth.
Our identity as a successful professional.
Yeah, totally.
The ego is terrified of that kind of change.
It's a fear of failure, fear of rejection.
Even the fear of death itself.
Yeah.
It all comes back to this fear of the ego dissolving.
Yes, because the ego clings to this constructed identity.
And is terrified of losing it.
But here's the thing.
Osho pointed out that
by becoming aware of the ego's attachments,
we can start to loosen fear's grip.
Okay.
It's like realizing that the puppet master isn't as powerful as we thought.
I like that.
Okay, so we've got these psychological fears.
Often fueled by the ego's need for control.
But what did Osho suggest we actually do about it?
Well, this is where Osho's approach.
Differs from what we usually hear.
Okay.
Because instead of urging us to fight our fears...
or to suppress them.
He advocated for something quite radical, actually.
What's that?
Acceptance.
Wait, acceptance? Seriously?
That sounds completely counterintuitive.
I know, right?
Isn't that like giving in to fear?
It might seem that way at first.
But Osho emphasized that when we resist fear...
and when we try to conquer it...
through sheer willpower...
we actually give it more power. It's like trying to push a beach ball underwater.
The harder you push, the harder it fights back.
Okay, so instead of wrestling with the fear...
you should,
sit with it. Observe it.
Exactly.
Osho encouraged us to face our fears directly.
To become aware of them.
And observe them without judgment.
He believed that through this process of acceptance...
we can start to see fear for what it truly is.
And what's that?
A mental construct.
An emotion created by the mind.
Not an absolute reality.
That's such a different way of thinking about it.
So it's not about pretending the fear isn't there.
It's about changing our relationship to it.
Exactly.
But how does that actually work?
Well, think of it this way.
By accepting fear.
You're no longer adding fuel to the fire.
Okay.
It's like acknowledging a wave in the ocean.
You don't try to fight the wave, you learn to ride it.
Okay, That makes sense.
It's like fear's grip starts to loosen.
And you can finally breathe again.
That's a great way to put it.
Through acceptance, fear can begin to lose its grip
It becomes less of a terrifying monster
and more of a wave of energy
that we can learn from.
and ultimately move beyond.
That's much more empowering than feeling like I'm...
Constantly battling my fears.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it makes you wonder.
What other illusions might we be holding on to?
That's a great question.
And it leads us to another fascinating aspect.
Of Osho's teaching.
The illusion of security.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
Tell me more.
Osho observed that a huge part of our fear comes from this deep-seated need for security.
Yeah.
We crave it.
Totally.
In our relationships, in our finances, our health.
We're always trying to create these structures
Right.
and routines to kind of protect ourselves from the unknown.
It's like we're constantly looking for that feeling of control,
Yes.
like knowing what's coming next.
But I can see how that might backfire.
Exactly.
The irony is that this pursuit of security...
Can actually create more fear.
Oh, how so?
Well, because Osho pointed out that
Nothing in life is truly permanent.
or predictable.
Right.
Change is inevitable.
Loss is inevitable.
It's true.
And so clinging to this idea of,
Absolute security just sets us up for...
disappointment and anxiety,
It's like building a house of cards.
and then being terrified of the slightest breeze.
That's a great analogy.
And so Osho encouraged this kind of radical shift in perspective.
He said instead of fearing change and uncertainty
What if we embrace them?
as natural parts of life,
Really?
he saw insecurity and impermanence,
Not as threats
but as opportunities for growth.
and exploration.
So it's not about eliminating fear.
It's about fundamentally changing our relationship to life itself.
Accepting that uncertainty and change are part of the journey.
That's the heart of it.
And what's remarkable is
Osho takes this even further.
Okay, where does he go from there?
He suggests that fear
Rather than something to be avoided.
can actually be a powerful catalyst.
Wait, fear is a pathway.
Now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, he believed that when we face our fears head on
When we really, dig deep,
and try to understand them.
they can reveal a lot about ourselves.
Okay.
They kind of highlight
Our insecurities, our attachment.
the areas where we're holding ourselves back.
It's like fear is a hidden treasure map.
Yes.
Pointing us toward the places where we need to grow.
Precisely.
Imagine, fear saying to you,
Hey, pay attention here.
this is where you're stuck.
This is where you're limiting yourself.
And by working through that fear
We can break free from those limitations.
and move closer to our authentic selves.
That's such a powerful reframing.
Instead of being this enemy to conquer,
Fear becomes this teacher.
guiding us on our journey.
Exactly.
And the lessons that we learn from facing our fears,
Can be really profound.
they can lead to greater self-awareness
Deeper compassion.
and ultimately a more fulfilling life.
Osho often said,
Running from our fears keeps us stuck.
but moving towards them
With open hearts.
is what truly sets us free.
I'm thinking about my own experiences.
I can see how some of my biggest leaps forward.
Came after facing down a major fear.
It's like on the other side of that fear.
Yeah.
There's this whole new level of confidence.
And possibility.
And that's exactly what Osho was getting at.
But what about that ultimate goal?
That so many spiritual traditions talk about,
Fearlessness.
right?
How does Osho's perspective fit with that?
That's a great question.
Is he saying we should all aim?
To become completely fearless
This is where Osho's perspective
really challenges conventional wisdom.
Okay.
He said true fearlessness,
Doesn't come from suppressing fear.
or pretending it doesn't exist,
It doesn't come from building walls.
to protect ourselves.
So it's not about being some kind of superhero
right.
who never feels a flicker of fear.
That's a relief, to be honest.
Osho's vision of fearlessness,
Is much more nuanced. He believed it arises from
a deep understanding.
of the nature of fear itself.
It's about recognizing that fear is simply a thought,
an emotion.
a temporary state of mind.
It's not who we are
Okay.
at our core.
That it's dense.
It's like those thoughts that pop into our heads.
We don't have to believe them
We can just observe them.
and let them pass.
Exactly.
And one of the most powerful tools
that Osho offered for cultivating this awareness.
is meditation.
Okay.
Through meditation
We learn to observe our thoughts
and emotions.
with a sense of detachment.
We start to see that.
We are not our fears.
We are not our anxieties
We are the observer
to witness.
to these passing mental states.
I've definitely noticed that when I'm meditating regularly.
Those everyday fears don't seem to have,
The same grip on me?
I have more space between me.
Yeah.
And the fear,
That's the power of awareness.
it's like turning up the lights in a dark room.
The shadows that seem so menacing
Suddenly lose their hold on us.
So instead of trying to conquer fear,
through sheer force of will,
we can actually transcend it.
through understanding and awareness.
That's the essence of Osho's teaching.
He invites us to embrace fear.
To learn from it.
And ultimately recognize that
True fearlessness lies,
not in the absence of fear,
but in the realization that fear cannot touch our true nature.
this is such a profound
And liberating idea.
like fear is still there.
But it's just not running the show anymore.
Exactly.
And that shift in perspective,
Can be incredibly empowering
it allows us to face challenges.
with more courage and grace.
Because we're no longer...
Consumed by that fear.
This deep dive has been so insightful.
I feel like I'm seeing fear
In a whole new light.
before we wrap up.
Is there anything else in Osho's teachings?
That could help us apply this wisdom.
In our daily lives?
One of the things that Osho emphasized repeatedly
Was the importance of living.
in the present moment.
Okay.
He saw fear as often stemming from
Worries about the past.
or anxieties about the future.
It's like we're letting our minds run wild.
With what ifs and should haves.
Instead of focusing on what's actually happening.
Exactly. And when we're trapped in those thought patterns,
Easy to get swept away.
by fear.
Right.
Osho believed that by cultivating a practice of presence,
Of bringing our attention to the here and now.
we can actually diminish the power of fear.
So if we're fully present.
There's no space for those fear-based thoughts
Precisely.
to take hold.
It's like the mind is a stage.
And when we're present
The spotlight is shining brightly.
on the present moment.
There's no room for the shadows of fear to creep in.
So practicing presence,
Whether through meditation or mindfulness,
or just being more aware of our surroundings.
can be a powerful antidote to fear.
Absolutely.
And the more we cultivate this practice of presence,
The more we realize that
this present moment,
is all we truly have.
the past is gone.
The future is uncertain.
All we can control
is how we choose to experience this moment.
right here, right now.
That's such a beautiful
An empowering reminder.
It takes the pressure off of
Trying to control everything.
and allows us to simply be
Without fear.
in the present moment.
Yeah, that really puts things into perspective.
It's not about erasing fear completely
It's more about shifting our focus.
to the present moment.
And recognizing that we have the power to choose.
How we respond to that fear.
Exactly. And that choice
And a conscious awareness.
is where true freedom lies.
It's about understanding that
We are not our fears.
we were something much greater.
Much more expansive.
And by, understanding the nature of fear,
By accepting it and even embracing it.
we can tap into that deeper truth.
And live a life that is truly fearless.
Not because we never feel fear.
But because we understand that fear doesn't have to control us.
Osho's teachings offer a path to freedom from fear.
Not through, struggle and resistance.
But through understanding, acceptance.
And a deep connection to our own inner being.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
I feel like we've peeled back layers of understanding.
And uncovered a whole new way
of relating to fear.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
I always find Osho's teachings
Offer such a unique and insightful perspective.
on the human experience.
Before we go, I have to ask,
What's that final thought-provoking question?
you have for our listener today
Something to really make them think.
about their own relationship with fear?
Well, you know what? As we've been exploring Osho's teachings,
We've seen how fear can be a teacher, a guide.
even a pathway to transformation.
So my question for you is this.
What if instead of trying to conquer your fears
Here, embrace them.
as opportunities for self-discovery and growth,
What might you learn about yourself
about life,
if you dared to step into those shadowy corners?
and face your fears with curiosity and compassion?
Wow, that's a powerful question to sit with.
It really challenges us to rethink
Our whole approach to fear.
instead of seeing it as something to avoid or conquer,
Maybe we can start to see it.
as a source of insight and growth.
Something that can help us become more fully ourselves.
That's the invitation Osho offers.
To move from a place of fear
To a place of awareness
acceptance, and even gratitude.
for the lessons that fear can teach us.
This has been an incredible journey
Thank you for sharing your insights.
and helping us navigate.
This complex and often misunderstood terrain of fear.
It's been my pleasure.
I always find that exploring Osho's teachings,
Is a journey of discovery.
and I hope our listener feels inspired
To continue exploring these ideas.
and applying them to their own life.
I think this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about.
And remember, fear is a natural part of life.
But it doesn't have to define you.
Embrace the journey. Learn from your fears.
And step into the freedom that comes
From understanding that you are so much more.
than your fears. Thanks for joining us.